You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. On October 29, 1777, George Washington brought up a crucial decision with his generals about where to station the Continental Army during the upcoming winter. Alongside advice from his military officers, Washington also navigated through suggestions from political figures. Lawmakers from Pennsylvania and the Second Continental Congress were keen on finding a winter shelter that would not only protect the troops but also safeguard the surroundings of Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. There was even talk among some Congress members about possibly conducting a campaign during the winter. Various locations were proposed, including Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. But after the undecided Battle of White Marsh from December 5th to 8th, more officers and politicians recognized the importance of defending the broader Philadelphia area from British forces. Valley Forge emerged as a strong candidate for several reasons. Its elevated terrain made enemy attacks challenging. Its position was strategic for dispatching soldiers to protect the surrounding lands easily. The nearby Schuylkill River would aid in the delivery of supplies, and the ample open spaces were perfect for training exercises. On December 19th, Washington led his 12,000 soldiers to Valley Forge to set up camp. The main encampment was set up on the flat lands to the east of Mount Joy and south of the Schuylkill River. In addition to the troops at Valley Forge, Washington had nearly 2,000 soldiers stationed in Wilmington, Delaware. He also placed the Army's cavalry in Trenton, New Jersey, and established additional outposts in Downingtown and Radnor, Pennsylvania, among other locations. In the winters before Valley Forge, the Army had used a mix of tents, makeshift huts, and local buildings for shelter. The move to Valley Forge was the first time Washington ordered the Army to build a more lasting encampment, leading them to construct their own shelters. This decision marked a significant shift and brought about a whole new set of challenges for the American patriots. George Washington once reflected on the hardships his men faced as they arrived at Valley Forge, noting how the soldiers were without basic necessities such as clothes, blankets, and shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Despite these challenging conditions, Washington remarked on the extraordinary patience and obedience of his troops, who did not complain despite taking up winter quarters just a day's march from the enemy, with no shelter available until they could build their own. The encampment at Valley Forge marked the first time the Continental Army undertook a massive construction project to create living quarters. Although there aren't precise figures, it's estimated that between 1,300 and 1,600 log huts were constructed. Without any contemporary images, our understanding of the Valley Forge cantonment comes mainly from the written accounts of General Washington, other soldiers' letters, and notebooks. Brigadier General Louis Lebesgue de Presles Duportet was instrumental in selecting the location and designing the layout for these encampments. Following his lead, officers were tasked with determining the exact placement for every hut for both officers and enlisted men. Despite efforts to maintain a uniform standard, the huts varied greatly in size, materials, and how they were built. According to military historian John B.B. Trussell, Jr., some soldiers dug their floors nearly 2 feet below ground to offer some protection against the wind and to save on building materials. Roofing materials also varied, with some huts featuring thatched straw and others made from brush, canvas, or clapboards. In the dire conditions of February 16, 1778, Washington wrote to George Clinton, the governor of the province of New York, describing the severe shortages in camp, indicating that parts of the army had gone without meat for days, leading to near-famine conditions. He admired the incomparable patience and fidelity of his soldiers, who remained loyal despite severe hardships. Lafayette, in a letter to his wife Adrienne, bleakly described the huts as small barracks, comparing them to dungeons in their lack of cheerfulness. When the Continental Army settled into Valley Forge, it was essentially like moving a small colonial city of around 12,000 people, including men, women, and children, into the area. This presented the Patriot leaders and lawmakers with a monumental task, supplying a large population through a tumultuous winter. Earlier, in May and June 1777, there were attempts to reorganize the supply department by the Continental Congress, but those efforts largely didn't take hold due to ongoing battles near Philadelphia. By the time the Army arrived at Valley Forge, the supply system had already collapsed, largely because Congress had neglected it. By the end of December 1777, General George Washington, who had chosen Valley Forge for its strategic position, found himself unable to provide sufficient food or clothing for his troops, hindered further by the poor conditions of winter roads. That winter proved lethal, with starvation and disease claiming the lives of over 1,000 soldiers and around 1,500 horses. Despite Washington's orders for rations, which included flour or bread, meat, peas or beans, and whiskey, The army often couldn't secure these supplies. Food either rotted on its way to camp due to poor storage and transportation, or got lost or intercepted by the enemy. The dangerous journey to market, combined with a lack of hard currency, also led to inflated prices. Initially, many soldiers had to make do with fire cakes, a basic mix of flour and water. Joseph Plum Martin, reflecting on the ordeal, recalled the daunting task of constructing shelters in the wilderness under such dire conditions. The soldiers grew increasingly resentful towards those they blamed for their suffering. In a letter to Henry Lawrence, then President of the Continental Congress, on December 23rd, Washington vividly described the situation, reporting a nearly mutinous state among his men due to the lack of provisions. He urgently warned that without significant changes, the army would either starve, dissolve, or scatter to fend for themselves. Though Washington was dealing with a severe crisis, it's noted he might have overstated the case to prompt a swift response from Congress. Despite expectations, the winter at Valley Forge wasn't exceptionally harsh, yet many soldiers remained unfit for duty due to disease and inadequate clothing. Lafayette, years later, would remember the men's terrible suffering, with many enduring frostbite to the point of needing amputations. A glimmer of hope arrived on January 7th, when a group of Philadelphia women, loyal to the cause, managed to drive in oxen and smuggle 2,000 shirts for the troops right under the enemy's nose. This vital support went widely unnoticed, a deliberate strategy to keep such activities hidden from the British. The Army's prospects began to improve with the late January arrival of a congressional delegation, including Francis Dana, Nathaniel Folsom, John Harvey, Gouverneur Morris, and Joseph Reed. Their visit exposed them to the Army's vulnerability to logistical disruptions. Prompted by Washington, they agreed to implement reforms in the supply chain. In March 1778, Nathaniel Greene was appointed Quartermaster General. Despite his reluctance for an administrative role, Greene's efforts, alongside improved weather and the thawing Schuylkill River, enhanced the supply lines, marking a turning point in supporting the troops stationed at Valley Forge. Keeping the Continental Army's camps clean was quite the struggle. The soldiers had to deal with scabies and other deadly diseases, mainly because their living conditions were pretty unsanitary. Imagine, they didn't have enough water for cooking, cleaning, or even bathing. There were even dead horses lying around, and according to George Washington himself, the stench in some areas was just unbearable. They lacked basic plumbing and didn't have a proper way to remove trash. To try and keep diseases at bay, Washington ordered his soldiers to burn tar or gunpowder inside their huts every day, hoping to purify the air. On one occasion, Washington instructed his troops to make their huts more ventilated by removing the mud and straw filling from the walls, all in an effort to get some fresh air flowing through. Despite these efforts, outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, influenza, and pneumonia were common, often spread through contaminated food and water. Typhus, spread by body lice, also claimed lives. While the army wasn't starving, the irregular delivery of food certainly didn't help those who were sick to recover. It's possible that some soldiers were battling more than one sickness at a time. Throughout the encampment at Valley Forge, around 1,700 to 2,000 soldiers died, mostly in hospitals spread across 6 towns. This made Valley Forge the deadliest encampment for the Continental Army, with more deaths than many battles of the war. Despite these grim circumstances, Washington managed to take a significant step against smallpox, a constant threat since the start of the American Revolution in 1775. In January 1777, he had ordered a mass inoculation of his troops. Yet by the time they were at Valley Forge, smallpox emerged once more. It turned out that 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers hadn't been inoculated despite being long-term enlistees. So, Washington called for vaccinations for any at-risk soldiers. This effort was no small feat. Inoculation was a precursor to vaccination, introduced by Edward Jenner in 1798, and involved giving someone a milder form of smallpox to ensure they'd recover and be immune for life, bypassing the disease's usual mortality rate of 15 to 33%. When the Continental Army left Valley Forge in June 1778, they had successfully carried out what could be called the first large-scale, government-backed immunization campaign in history. By keeping up with vaccinations for new recruits, Washington significantly bolstered the military strength of his army for the rest of the war. In every hut at Valley Forge, a squad of 12 soldiers made their home, but often these quarters also welcomed their families, including wives and children. Around 250 to 400 women like Mary Ludwig Hayes trailed their soldier husbands or boyfriends to Valley Forge, sometimes bringing their kids along. George Washington himself once mentioned that though the presence of many women, especially those pregnant or with children, slowed down military operations, Their contribution was critical. These women played essential roles, working as nurses or laundering clothes, which not only improved the troops' health but also their professionalism and discipline. Some of the officers' wives, including Lucy Flucker Knox and Catherine Littlefield Catty Green, travelled to Valley Forge at their husband's request. Martha Washington was among them, arriving in February after a difficult journey, and for the next 6 months played host to various political and military leaders, managing a bustling domestic setup within the cramped quarters of Washington's headquarters. Valley Forge was a melting pot of racial and ethnic diversity, with about 30% of the Continental soldiers there not speaking English as their mother tongue. This mix included soldiers and commanders from German, Scottish, Irish, French and Dutch backgrounds, highlighting the wide range of communities represented in Washington's army. A notable effort from Rhode Island saw the enlistment of enslaved African Americans into the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, offering them freedom in return for military service. This move, revolutionary in its time, allowed for the emancipation of 117 enslaved recruits before the repeal of this law, integrating them into a military force that by January 1778 saw nearly 10% of its ranks filled by African American troops. Alongside, various servants and enslaved individuals, such as Washington's manservant William Lee, were part of the encampment's daily life, with some, like Hannah Till, working towards earning their freedom during their service. By the spring of 1778, Native American warriors from tribes like the Wappinger, Oneida, and Tuscarora joined the Patriots at Valley Forge. These scouts, including the significant Oneida leader Joseph Louis Cook, were pivotal in monitoring British movements and even fought under Lafayette. The One Theories, in a notable act of support, provided vital food supplies to the starving troops, demonstrating the complex alliances formed during the war. Despite most Native American tribes siding with the British to protect their lands, tribes like the Oneida chose to align with the Patriots, drawn by established relationships and shared interests, showcasing the diverse and multifaceted nature of support for the revolutionary cause. During the winter at Valley Forge, the Continental Army faced some serious challenges with how it was organized. After 2 years of fighting, changes in leadership, and inconsistent recruitment, the Army's units were all over the place in terms of organization and strength. To address this, the Army underwent a major reorganization at Valley Forge, creating 5 divisions led by Major Generals Charles Lee, Marquis de Lafayette, Johann de Kalb, and William Alexander, who was known as Lord Stirling. Brigadier General Anthony Wayne stepped in for Mifflin. They also worked on making the size of units and the length of service more uniform, which really helped improve how efficiently the Army operated. Even though enlisted soldiers really supported George Washington, he wasn't as popular among the officers and congressional officials. While hunkered down at Valley Forge, some of Washington's critics didn't hold back, criticizing his leadership in private letters and even in the press. One anonymous letter from January 1778 didn't mince words, claiming the proper methods of attacking, beating, and conquering the enemy has never as yet been adapted by the commander-in-chief. The biggest challenge to Washington's leadership was something called the Conway Cabal. This was a small group of military officers and American politicians who were gunning to replace Washington with Major General Horatio Gates as the commander of the Continental Army. The cabal was loosely led by Thomas Conway, who was not a fan of Washington's leadership style. However, after a series of embarrassing leaks and revelations in late 1777 and early 1778, the plot fell apart, and Washington came out of it with his reputation not just intact but actually stronger. Improving the Army's morale, efficiency, and discipline, along with securing better food and arms supplies, significantly enhanced the soldiers' well-being. Previously, the Continental Army faced considerable challenges in battle due to the use of different field manuals by various units, which made coordinating their movements in battle awkward and challenging. They had trouble with basic formations and lacked consistency because they were taught multiple drilling techniques in various ways by different officers. Enter Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian drill master who had just come from Europe. He implemented a strict training regimen for the troops. Steuben's training transformed the soldiers by refining their battle techniques and formations. He led the soldiers to practice volley fire, increased their agility, standardized the pace at which they marched, trained them in skirmishing tactics, and enhanced their skills with the bayonet. Under Steuben's guidance, these new training and disciplinary efforts also boosted the soldiers' morale. Initially, France was hesitant to jump into the fight against Great Britain alongside the American colonies. They were concerned about revolutionary ideas spreading back to France, a fear that became reality by the year 1789, and they doubted the Americans' chances of victory. However, the tide turned when British General John Burgoyne's army surrendered in Saratoga in October 1777, demonstrating that the Americans could indeed pose a serious challenge. This pivotal event convinced France and other foreign powers to support the American cause. As a result, France entered into a military alliance with the United States on February 6, 1778. Great Britain's reaction was swift, declaring war on France just 5 weeks later, on March 17th. In the spirit of celebration and solidarity with their new ally, on May 6th, General Washington commanded the Continental Army to hold a grand feu de joie, a ceremonial gunfire celebration. Continental officer George Ewing documented the event, describing how the troops cheered for the King of France, the friendly powers of Europe and the American states, all while enjoying an extra ration of rum. The day ended in high spirits, with Washington and other officers making patriotic toasts. Both France and Great Britain, as global powers, had territories worldwide that needed safeguarding. When Sir Henry Clinton took over as the British Commander-in-Chief in North America, he had to move troops from Philadelphia to protect the British holdings in the West Indies, especially with the threat of a French naval blockade. Consequently, Clinton relocated his base to New York City, a region with strong Loyalist support. Following the British trail on June 18th, Washington led his troops out of Valley Forge, exactly 6 months after their arrival, marking another significant moment in the fight for American independence. Valley Forge holds a special place in the heart of American history and storytelling. It is more than just a location in Pennsylvania. It is a historic national park that has captured the essence of what many believe to be a critical moment of perseverance and suffering in the country's past. Historians have explored how Valley Forge is seen, not just for the actual events that took place there, but for the powerful myths that have shaped our patriotic view of this significant place in America's story. One of the most persistent myths about Valley Forge is the brutal weather the soldiers endured. Over time, stories have depicted the encampment as covered in snow, with soldiers suffering from frostbite and exposure, leading to numerous deaths and amputations. However, historical records suggest that the weather was not as harsh as the myths suggest. Snow was rare, temperatures were often above freezing, and ice was not common. The tales of severe winter conditions likely got mixed up with the winter of 1779 to 1780 at Jockey Hollow, near Morristown, New Jersey, which did experience the harshest winter of the war. Another popular myth is the image of George Washington praying in the snow at Valley Forge, asking for divine intervention for his troubled army. This story has been immortalized in art, sculpture, and even mentioned by former President Ronald Reagan. But the truth is, there is no contemporary evidence that this event ever occurred. The tale traces back to an article from 1803 by Mason Locke Weems, a minister and biographer of Washington, who claimed a man named Isaac Potts stumbled upon Washington in prayer. However, Isaac Potts did not live near Valley Forge when the encampment took place, and did not even marry his wife until 1803, casting doubt on the story's authenticity. Despite its questionable origins, the story has been repeated many times over the years, becoming a part of the lore of Valley Forge. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.